Are you a liberal or a conservative? Are you left or right wing? Are you male, female, or an Apache helicopter? Before you go answering those first two questions, let's add some historical context to complicate it. Now, what do we usually think of when we think of the words liberal and conservative? Well, usually when we think of liberalism, we think of big government, a more centrally planned economy, and collectivism. And when we think of modern conservatives, we tend to think of limited government, free markets, and individualism. Now, there are countless nuances to the individuals who think of themselves as liberals or conservatives, but for the sake of creating a general model, let's use simplified definitions. Now, conservatism has existed for basically forever, but liberalism, at least as an ideology, is far newer. And when thinking about the history of liberalism, we usually begin with John Locke. Although ideas that we recognize as liberal existed before John Locke, as an ideology, liberalism didn't really come into existence until about the Enlightenment, so I think this is where we should establish our definitions. So, in the 18th and 19th century, people like John Locke and Thomas Jefferson would have been seen as liberals. But liberalism then was very different from what liberalism is today. During the days of Locke and Jefferson, a liberal was someone who wanted limited government, free markets, and individual liberty. In case you didn't notice, that's pretty much the opposite of what modern-day liberals believe, and the same is true for conservatives. At the time of the American Revolution, a conservative was a supporter of absolutism, mercantilism, which is a kind of centrally planned economy, and paternalism, where the needs of society as a whole are enforced by a God-ordained government, which is basically the opposite of what we think of in regards to modern-day conservatives. So basically, the definition's flipped. Today we use terms such as classical liberal or Neo-Liberalism to differentiate liberals from the 19th century and earlier from the 20th and 21st century, but how did this happen? Why did the terms flip? Why don't modern Democrats refer to themselves as being conservatives, while modern Republicans refer to themselves as being liberals? Well, there's historical context to this, and to the shock of modern liberals, it involves cultural appropriation. So, to understand this, we're going to need to know a little bit of political history, at least to understand it in the American context. The Constitutional Convention gave birth to the two main strains of American politics. On one hand, you have the Jeffersonians, who identified with liberal ideas of limited government, free markets, and individual liberty. On the other hand, you had the Hamiltonians, who identified with the conservative ideas of big government, mercantilism, and paternalism, minus the monarchism. Jeffersonians gave birth to the First Republican Party, while the Hamiltonians gave birth to the Federalists. The membership of these two parties eventually merged together in what historians commonly refer to as the Democratic Republican Party, which broke up in the 1820s into the Democrats, who identified with the Jeffersonian liberalism, and the Whigs, who identified with Hamiltonian conservatism. The Whigs eventually gave way to the Republicans, who continued to identify with the Hamiltonian ideas. Where things begin to get complicated is in the progressive era around the beginning of the 20th century. You had Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson occupying intersections between traditional conservative and liberal positions. Taft and Roosevelt were conservatives in their day, but they embraced trust-busting, which occupies a strange space in American political tradition. On the one hand, trust-busting is supposedly a means of ensuring that free market competition can continue by breaking up monopolies. However, on the other hand, it's a means for the government to intervene in the economy, which is usually a centrally planned economy model. Then you had Woodrow Wilson, who campaigned as a free market liberal progressive. However, his presidency saw a massive expansion of government that is traditionally associated with conservatism, especially after the US entry into the First World War, which saw the federal government essentially take over the entire economy, regulating the usage of nearly every resource. 1920 saw a reaction to Wilson's big government progressivism from Warren Harding and his return to normalcy idea, which in the American context, returning to normalcy would be small government liberalism. So here we see the beginnings of the ideological shifts for Republicans and Democrats, where Republicans start drifting towards Jeffersonian liberalism and Democrats start drifting towards Hamiltonian conservatism. But at this point, the words liberalism and conservatism are still associated with their 19th century meanings. This all changes in 1932 in the election between Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the sitting president Herbert Hoover. Toward the beginning of that election, FDR accused Herbert Hoover of taking the United States down the road to socialism. But in September of 1932, FDR gave a speech to the Commonwealth Club, in which he started portraying these big government Hamiltonian ideas as being associated with liberalism. The growth of the national governments of Europe was a struggle for the development of a centralized force in the nation, strong enough to impose peace upon ruling barons. The people preferred the masters far away to the exploitation and cruelty of the smaller master near at hand. They were often cruel in their methods, but they did strive steadily towards something that society needed and very much wanted. A strong central state, able to keep the peace, to stamp out civil war, to put the unruly nobleman in his place, and to permit the bulk of individuals to live safely. FDR promoted these ideas, which were largely inspired by his time in the Wilson administration, as being liberal. The idea that government can solve social and economic ills was a tenet of early 20th century progressivism. But the Wilson administration had made the American people despise the concept of progressivism. So, in order to push through these ideas, he had to relabel it as something more appealing. And so, FDR appropriated the term liberalism for big government progressivism. By the end of his presidency in 1945, liberalism was associated with big government, central economic planning, and collectivism, and conservatism became associated with limited government, free markets, and individual liberty. The last detail of this story comes from the 1988 election, when Vice President George H.W. Bush managed to make the word liberal a dirty word in politics, associated with being soft on crime, high taxes, and fiscal irresponsibility. By the end of the 90s, the Democrats started calling themselves progressives as a replacement for the word liberal, which is more historically accurate to their party's current ideology.
I prefer the word progressive, which has a real American meaning, going back to the progressive era at the beginning of the 20th century. I consider myself a modern progressive.
Because of this history, we haven't seen any significant attempts to try to reclaim the word liberal. You have some like Dave Rubin who occasionally use the word, but for both conservatives and libertarians, you are more likely to see them use the term classical liberal because plain liberalism has too much baggage attached to it now. There is the possibility the Democrats might abandon the phrase progressive if people get tired of their ideas again and pick up the word liberal. But unlike in the early 20th century, there aren't really anyone in the Republican Party who refer to themselves as progressives, even if some of them do have those ideas. And I think the ultimate loser in this story is the word liberal and liberalism, because it had a meaning, but it was appropriated for something else, for someone else's political needs, and then it was tarnished by the other side, who actually was liberal, because the word had become associated with the things that it's not supposed to be. I would like to thank my patrons for making this video possible, especially my executive producer, Leo Hockhauser. Thanks to your support, I can continue to make these videos for everyone to learn from and enjoy. If you would like to financially support the content I make on this channel, you can do so by going to patreon.com/GrantHurst, where you can become a patron and get access to videos early or your name in the end credits. If you're interested in learning more about American politics, I have a playlist of videos I made about that right down below. If you like this video, then make sure you subscribe and click the bell icon to make sure you are aware of whenever videos come up. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.